Hello there, my companion, in these quiet moments at the end of the day. Welcome to our little corner of the world where stories from the past no longer shout with thunderous battles or earth shattering conspiracies, but instead whisper softly like a gentle lullaby echoing from ages long gone. The night has fallen, hasn't it? Perhaps you're lying here now, curled up in your warm blankets, searching for a bit of peace, a gentle escape from the day's endless demands. And that's exactly why we're meeting here, in this space where history is no longer dry lessons, but misty paintings, scattered fragments of lives once lived. Tonight, we'll gently lift the veil of time together to glimpse into things that are, well, perhaps a little peculiar. The everyday habits, those seemingly mundane details of people who have become legends. Have you ever wondered how an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, someone considered a living god, began their day? Was it anything like ours, with a cup of coffee and quickly scrolling through morning news? Or was it something entirely different, something truly Egyptian? Don't worry, you don't need to try to remember anything. There won't be any test tomorrow morning. Just let your mind drift. Allow these words to flow past you, like the gentle Nile River, carrying images, sounds, distant sensations. Let curiosity guide you softly, and if your eyelids begin to grow heavy, well, that would be our success. If you enjoy journeys like this, consider subscribing to our channel, or simply return here whenever you need a friend to tell you bedtime stories. And if you have any thoughts, however vague, feel free to leave a message. It's fascinating to know you're listening from somewhere out there in this vast world. But now, take a deep breath. Exhale slowly. Imagine you're standing by the banks of the Nile, under a star-filled night sky from thousands of years ago. The wind carries cool moisture and the faint fragrance of lotus flowers. Everything is still. Only the whispers of the past, and this voice beginning to tell you a story. You see, there's something magical about peering into the daily routines of those who came before us. While we rush through our mornings, checking phones and gulping down coffee, somewhere in ancient Egypt, a figure wrapped in divine authority was beginning their day in ways that would seem utterly foreign to us. Yet beneath all the ceremony and mystique, weren't they also just people? People who woke up, ate breakfast, dealt with responsibilities, and tried to find moments of joy in their days. Tonight, we'll discover that the distance between us and a pharaoh of ancient Egypt isn't measured only in thousands of years, but in the strange, wonderful, sometimes absurd ways humans have chosen to live their lives. We'll peek behind the golden masks and royal proclamations to find the gloriously human details that historians sometimes forget to mention. The beauty of these bedtime journeys through history isn't in memorizing dates or dynasties. It's in that quiet moment of recognition when you realize that people separated from us by millennia were wrestling with surprisingly familiar challenges. How do I start my day right? How do I balance work and personal time? How do I maintain relationships while dealing with enormous responsibilities? The answers they found were, well, let's just say they were creative. As we wander through these ancient halls tonight, you might find your breathing slowing, your thoughts becoming softer around the edges. That's perfectly natural. History, when told in whispers rather than shouts, has a way of settling into your bones. becoming part of your dreams. The facts and figures matter less than the feeling, the gentle surprise of discovering that humans have always been wonderfully, bewilderingly complex. So settle in deeper, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to meet some of the most powerful people who ever lived, not in their moments of triumph or tragedy, but in their breakfast routines, their grooming habits, and their surprisingly relatable daily frustrations. These aren't the history book versions of these figures. These are the three-dimensional humans who had to figure out, just like you, how to get through another day. The desert wind is picking up now, carrying with it the scent of ancient mysteries and the promise of stories worth telling. The pages of time are rustling, ready to reveal their secrets. Your breathing is becoming deeper, more relaxed, and your mind is opening to possibilities you've never considered. Are you ready to discover what it was really like to wake up as a god? Picture this, if you will. The sun has just begun to stretch its first golden fingers across the endless desert. That warm, honey-colored light slowly paints the sand dunes pink, chasing away the night's chill. And within the royal palace, a new day for the Pharaoh, embodiment of Horus, child of Ra, is about to begin. But what exactly does normal look like for a living god? Let's find out together. The Pharaoh's bed wasn't the memory foam mattress we might expect for someone of ultimate power. Imagine instead a masterpiece carved from precious cedar wood, its legs shaped like the powerful paws of lions or the protective forms of guardian deities. The bed frame itself told stories, intricate carvings that depicted the Pharaoh's divine lineage, his victories, and his eternal connection to the gods. Covering this royal resting place was the finest linen imaginable, linen so soft and smooth it felt like touching a whisper. The ancient Egyptians were incredibly proud of their linen, and rightfully so. But here's where things get interesting for our modern sensibilities. The pillow wasn't filled with down feathers. Instead, picture a headrest made of carved wood or even stone, designed to cradle the neck and keep those elaborate royal hairstyles perfectly in place. Comfortable? Well, that's debatable. But to them, it was the height of luxury. The bedroom itself might surprise you with its relative intimacy. Not enormous by palace standards, but every inch was meaningful. The walls burst with vibrant paintings, scenes of the pharaoh's great deeds, journeys through the afterlife, and the protective gazes of countless deities. The air hung heavy with the scent of frankincense or some exotic resin, creating an atmosphere that was part bedroom, part temple. But here's where the pharaoh's life gets truly fascinating, and perhaps a little exhausting. Even their dreams weren't private. Every morning, as golden light began to filter through those ancient windows, the pharaoh's dreams became, well, national security briefings. You see, a pharaoh's dreams weren't just dreams. They were divine messages, prophecies, warnings from the gods themselves. As the pharaoh stirred in those early morning hours, the sound of soft footsteps would approach. The kingdom's most learned priests, specialists in the ancient art of dream interpretation, summoned to decode the night's visions. Picture this scene. The pharaoh, perhaps still drowsy, recounting a dream of soaring hawks over the Nile. The priests lean forward, their faces grave with concentration. "My divine lord," one might whisper, "the hawk flies east. This foretells prosperity from our trading partners." But wait, in the dream, Did the hawk call 3 times or 4? Because 4 calls might indicate a different kind of visitor entirely, perhaps one requiring military preparation. A dream about flooding could mean the blessed annual inundation of the Nile, bringing fertility to the land. Or it could be a warning of chaos, enemies at the borders. A lion in the dream might represent the Pharaoh's own divine strength, or it could warn of a challenger to the throne. The pressure must have been extraordinary. Even in sleep, you couldn't escape the weight of an empire. Imagine never having a simple dream about being late for work or forgetting your pants. Every single image, every sensation from the night carried the potential weight of state policy. No wonder some pharaohs seemed to age quickly. They were literally working in their sleep. When the pharaoh's eyes opened each morning, it wasn't to the harsh buzz of an alarm clock. Instead, the most trusted servants in the kingdom would materialize like silent shadows at the bedside, appearing without a sound. But here's the fascinating part. These servants didn't dare make eye contact with the pharaoh while he was still in his mortal state fresh from sleep. The transformation from sleeping person to living deity was treated as a sacred metamorphosis that required careful handling. The bedroom would fill with the soft whisper of bare feet on cool stone, the gentle rustle of preparation, but no direct interaction until the rituals began. The daily bathing ceremony was far more than simple hygiene. It was a rebirth. Picture warm, perfumed water, possibly mixed with milk and honey, poured from golden vessels. The water itself had been blessed, perhaps drawn from sacred wells or the holy Nile at specific times. Every drop that touched the pharaoh's skin was considered an act of purification, washing away the vulnerability of sleep and mortality. But the real artistry began with the makeup application, and this is where modern beauty routines pale in comparison. The famous kohl eyeliner wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was practical magic. Made from ground galena, this thick, dark liner protected the eyes from the harsh desert sun, while also serving as spiritual armor against evil spirits. Imagine the scene. The pharaoh sits motionless as skilled artisans approach with tiny bronze implements and precious pigments. Each stroke of kohl is deliberate, precise, transforming ordinary human eyes into the penetrating gaze of a god. The application might take an hour, with servants holding polished bronze mirrors at perfect angles, ensuring every line achieves divine perfection. The royal wardrobe was a study in symbolic power dressing. Those famous pleated linen kilts, called shendit, weren't just fashion statements. They were made from linen so fine it was practically transparent, yet every pleat had to fall perfectly. The fabric was white, pure white, representing the pharaoh's spiritual cleanliness and divine nature. Then came the jewelry, and oh, what jewelry! We're talking about pieces that would make modern red carpet appearances look understated. The broad collar necklace, called an usek, might contain hundreds of perfectly matched beads of gold, turquoise, and carnelian. Each stone was chosen not just for beauty, but for its magical properties. Turquoise for protection, gold for eternal life, carnelian for courage in battle. The crowns deserve their own ceremony. The famous pshent, that double crown combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, wasn't just a hat. It was a physical manifestation of political unity, a reminder to everyone present that this person ruled a vast, complex civilization. The weight alone must have been substantial, but the symbolic weight was immeasurable. Or perhaps the pharaoh chose the Neem's headdress instead, that blue and gold striped head covering we recognize from Tutankhamun's burial mask. Putting it on was like donning the very essence of royal authority. Every fold had to be perfect, every stripe aligned, because this wasn't just getting dressed, this was becoming divine. The servants performing these rituals moved with the precision of dancers, each knowing their exact role in this daily transformation. One might be responsible solely for the royal sandals, another for the ceremonial false beard. Yes, even female pharaohs sometimes wore them. Another for the sacred oils that gave the skin a subtle, otherworldly glow. By the time this morning ritual concluded, often taking several hours, the sleepy human who had awakened was gone, replaced by a figure of such magnificent presence that simply looking upon them was considered a blessing. The servants would finally be permitted to meet the pharaoh's gaze. But now they were looking at a god. Now, you might imagine that breakfast for a living god would be an extravagant affair. Tables groaning under exotic delicacies, golden plates piled high with the rarest foods from across the empire. But the reality was both simpler and more complex than you might expect. The pharaoh's morning meal was actually quite modest by our standards, though every element carried profound meaning. Picture fresh bread, still warm from the palace ovens, made from the finest emmer wheat or barley. This wasn't just sustenance, it was a daily reminder of Egypt's agricultural abundance, the life-giving power of the Nile's annual flood. Dates and figs provided sweetness, their natural sugars offering energy for the demanding day ahead. A drizzle of honey, liquid gold they called it, might grace the bread. And here's something that might surprise you. Beer. Not the kind you'd grab from a convenience store, but a thick, nutritious brew that was more like liquid bread than our modern beverages. It was a staple food, especially during the cooler morning hours. The ritual surrounding the meal was as important as the food itself. The pharaoh typically ate in careful solitude, or perhaps with only the most intimate family members. Each bite was offered to them with ceremonial precision, no casual grabbing of food from a shared platter. Every morsel that passed the royal lips had been tasted first by official food tasters, a sobering reminder that even breakfast carried the potential for assassination. But think about the symbolism being consumed along with the meal. Every grain of bread represented the pharaoh's divine ability to ensure fertility of the land. Every sip of beer demonstrated their connection to the gods who blessed the harvest. The meal wasn't just about nutrition. It was a daily affirmation of the cosmic order that placed this person at the center of Egyptian civilization. There was no scrolling through morning news on a tablet, no rushed eating while checking emails. Instead, imagine the absolute mindfulness required when every meal is a religious ceremony. Every bite a reminder of your divine responsibilities to millions of people. After the morning rituals and sacred breakfast, the real work began. If you think modern executives have demanding schedules, imagine being responsible for an empire that stretches from Nubia to the Levant, with the added pressure that your every decision is considered divinely inspired. The throne room scene would make any modern boardroom feel casual by comparison. Picture soaring columns painted with hieroglyphs, walls depicting the pharaoh's divine lineage and great victories, and at the center, and throne that was itself a masterpiece of goldsmithing and symbolism. As the pharaoh took their seat, a process that itself followed strict protocol, the weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of expectation. The vizier, essentially the world's first chief operating officer, would approach with the day's agenda. But this wasn't a simple meeting schedule. These were matters of life and death, prosperity and disaster for millions of people. Reports arrived from across the empire: grain storage levels in Memphis, military intelligence from the Nubian frontier, updates on major construction projects like temples or pyramids, news of potential threats from neighboring kingdoms. Imagine the pharaoh, resplendent in gold and divine authority, listening as a weather-beaten messenger reports unusual Nile water levels. The entire court holds its breath. Too little water means famine. Too much means devastating floods. The pharaoh's response, perhaps just a slight nod or a few whispered words to the vizier, might determine whether grain stores are opened, whether emergency taxes are levied, whether diplomatic marriages are arranged to secure foreign grain supplies. The pressure of those moments, when you're expected to have divine insight into problems that would challenge modern governments with all their technology and expertise. Legal matters required the pharaoh's attention too. As the living embodiment of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth and justice, they served as the ultimate court of appeals. Disputes between provinces, accusations of corruption among officials, questions of inheritance that affected major land holdings, all required the divine perspective. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect was the construction projects. These weren't just buildings. They were statements about eternity, manifestations of divine will in stone and gold. A pharaoh might spend hours reviewing architectural plans for their own tomb, discussing with engineers and priests how to ensure their soul would have a proper home for eternity. Imagine planning your own funeral as a major part of your daily administrative duties, while also needing to approve the design of temples that would serve the gods for thousands of years. Foreign diplomacy added another layer of complexity. Ambassadors from Mesopotamia, envoys from Cyprus, trade delegations from mysterious lands to the south, all required audiences. The pharaoh had to project divine authority while navigating the practical realities of international relations. A slight misunderstanding in protocol could lead to war. Excessive generosity might be seen as weakness. Religious duties intertwined with every administrative decision. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, but the high priest of every god in the Egyptian pantheon. Scheduling temple ceremonies, approving religious festivals, consulting with high priests about proper rituals, these weren't side duties, but central to maintaining cosmic order. The most surreal aspect might have been the constant awareness that everyone present believed they were in the presence of an actual deity. No modern leader, however charismatic or powerful, deals with subordinates who literally believe them to be divine. Every word carried not just political weight, but spiritual significance. A casual comment might be interpreted as divine prophecy. A moment of visible frustration might be seen as a sign of cosmic displeasure. Even gods need downtime, and the pharaoh's leisure activities were as elaborate and meaningful as their official duties. But don't picture modern relaxation. Think of entertainment that simultaneously demonstrated power, maintained physical readiness for war, and reinforced divine status. Hunting was the ultimate royal pastime, but these weren't casual weekend trips to the countryside. Royal hunts were major expeditions involving hundreds of attendants, elaborate equipment, and prey that would make modern big game hunters nervous. Lions, hippos, crocodiles. The pharaoh was expected to face and defeat the most dangerous creatures in Egypt, proving their divine courage and protecting their people from deadly threats. Picture this: the pharaoh in a golden chariot, bow drawn, racing across the desert in pursuit of a lion, while dozens of guards discreetly ensure the divine safety. Artists sketch the scene for later temple reliefs, and priests offer prayers for successful hunting. It was sport, religious ritual, political theater, and military training all rolled into one spectacular event. Royal banquets were equally impressive productions. These weren't simple dinner parties, but elaborate festivals that might last for days. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted fowl, fresh fish from the Nile, exotic fruits, fine wines, and delicacies imported from across the known world. Musicians played harps, lyres, and flutes, while dancers performed intricate routines that told stories of the gods. But here's where things get endearingly human: board games. Yes, even pharaohs enjoyed quiet evenings, playing games with family and friends. Senet was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of our modern board games, but with cosmic significance. The game board represented the journey through the afterlife, and winning wasn't just entertainment, it was practice for the spiritual challenges awaiting in death. Imagine Tutankhamun, that young king we know so well from his golden burial mask, spending quiet evening hours playing Senet with his wife Enkesenamun. The game pieces moving across the board like souls navigating the underworld, while outside the palace walls, the vast machinery of empire continued its eternal dance. Family time provided perhaps the pharaoh's only truly private moments. Despite all the ceremony and divine status, they were still human beings with spouses who might tease them, children who occasionally misbehaved, and in-laws who could be complicated. The royal family quarters offered a rare space where divine authority could relax slightly, where a pharaoh might actually enjoy a normal conversation. The royal gardens provided another refuge. These weren't just landscape spaces, but carefully designed representations of paradise on earth. Pools reflected the sky, rare flowers perfumed the air, and carefully tended trees provided shade from the intense Egyptian sun. Here, a pharaoh might compose poetry, practice calligraphy, or simply sit in contemplation, temporarily freed from the demands of divine leadership. Evening brought its own rituals. As the sun, god Ra, began his nightly journey through the underworld, the pharaoh's day gradually wound down with ceremonies that mirrored the cosmic cycle. The transformation back to humanity was as carefully orchestrated as the morning's divine metamorphosis. And so, another day in the life of an Egyptian pharaoh draws to a close. What a strange blend it was: elaborate rituals that would suffocate us with their formality, life or death decisions affecting an entire civilization, and surprisingly intimate moments of simple human pleasure. From the moment dawn painted the desert gold until shadows claimed the palace halls, their life was an unending performance where every action, every word carried sacred meaning. How different it seems from our own routines, doesn't it? No snooze buttons, no rushed breakfast while checking phones. But perhaps, deep down, The fundamental human needs weren't so different after all. The desire for a good day's work, moments of relaxation, connection with loved ones, just expressed in ways that were truly divine. Now, let your mind drift along the Nile's current toward another distant land, another time, where strange habits were equally fascinating in their own mysterious ways. From the blazing deserts of Egypt, let us drift gently eastward to the towering walls of the Forbidden City in ancient China. Here, the Son of Heaven, considered the child of the celestial realm, governed a vast empire. But his life, despite reaching the heights of earthly luxury, was encased in countless rules, taboos, and an isolation so profound it becomes almost mystical. Let's discover together how a normal day unfolded for a Chinese emperor, shall we? The emperor's day began not with sunlight streaming through windows, but in the deep darkness before dawn, somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning. There was no snooze button in the Forbidden City, only the steady, inevitable rhythm of the watch drums and ceremonial bells echoing across the vast courtyards, calling the Son of Heaven to his divine duties. Imagine waking in that pre-dawn darkness, knowing that an entire empire was already stirring in preparation for your emergence. While most of his subjects still slept, the emperor was beginning the elaborate transformation from sleeping mortal back into the living symbol of cosmic order. The first sounds weren't alarm clocks or coffee makers, but the soft whisper of silk slippers on polished wooden floors as the most senior eunuchs and palace ladies approached the imperial bedchamber. They moved like ghosts in the darkness, their presence announced only by the subtle rustle of expensive fabric and the faint scent of sandalwood that seemed to permeate everything in the palace. Sleep, for an emperor, was never truly private. Even in dreams, the weight of the empire pressed down. Palace physicians monitored his rest, court astrologers interpreted any disturbances, and guards maintained vigilant watch outside doors that were themselves works of art, carved with protective dragons and painted in imperial yellow. The morning ablutions were a ceremony that could take hours. This wasn't a quick shower and brush of teeth. Every aspect of the emperor's preparation was choreographed with the precision of a religious ritual. The water for washing had been drawn from specific wells at specific times, blessed by court priests, and heated to precisely the right temperature by servants whose only job was understanding the imperial preferences for morning bathing. The clothing process alone could exhaust a modern person just watching. Layer upon layer of silk garments, each with its own significance. The dragon robes, those magnificent long pao with their intricate embroidery, weren't just clothing, but statements of cosmic authority. Every dragon represented imperial power. Every cloud symbolized divine favor. Every wave pattern connected the emperor to the flow of universal energy. Picture the scene. Dozens of attendants working in perfect synchronization, some holding different layers of robes, others managing the intricate jewelry and ceremonial accessories. The emperor stands motionless in the center, arms extended as they transform him piece by piece from a person into a symbol. The weight of the final ensemble, silk, gold, jade, precious stones, must have been substantial, but the symbolic weight was infinite. The morning meal was deliberately modest, almost austere. While we might expect lavish banquets, breakfast was typically simple porridge, perhaps a few delicate pastries, tea of the highest quality. The emperor's health was a matter of state security, so every bite was monitored, every ingredient carefully sourced and tested. Rich foods in the morning were avoided. The day ahead required mental clarity, not digestive struggles. But even this simple meal carried profound meaning. The bowls were priceless porcelain. The chopsticks might be ivory or jade, and the act of eating was observed by food tasters whose lives literally depended on the emperor's well-being. Imagine never being able to grab a quick snack without it becoming a formal ceremony, attended by a dozen people whose job was to ensure you didn't die from that snack. The morning audience was perhaps the most crucial part of the emperor's day, and certainly the most theatrical. Picture the Hall of Supreme Harmony, or a similar grand palace depending on the dynasty, with its soaring red columns, intricate ceiling paintings, and an atmosphere so formal it could suffocate spontaneity. As the emperor ascended to the dragon throne, the transformation from person to symbol reached completion. The throne itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and symbolism, carved dragons seeming to writhe in golden splendor, positioned to suggest that the emperor sat supported by celestial power itself. From this elevated position, he looked down upon rows of court officials, all dressed in robes that indicated their exact rank, all arranged in precise formations that had been perfected over centuries. The silence in these moments was profound. Hundreds of the empire's most educated, powerful men stood in absolute stillness, waiting for permission to speak, to move, sometimes even to breathe normally. The weight of this expectation, this divine theater, must have been almost unbearable. Court officials approached with reports that read like a catalog of human complexity. Tax collections from distant provinces, reports of flood damage along the Yellow River, intelligence about potential threats from northern nomads, updates on major construction projects, requests for imperial judgment on legal disputes. Each report required not just understanding, but wisdom that would affect millions of lives. Imagine the emperor listening as an official reports unusual weather patterns in Sichuan province. The entire court holds its breath. Too much rain means flooding and potential famine. Too little means drought and certain famine. The emperor's response, perhaps a slight nod toward the minister of works, a whispered instruction to a eunuch secretary, might set in motion relief efforts involving thousands of workers, emergency grain distributions, or diplomatic missions to neighboring kingdoms for trade agreements. The pressure of those moments, when divine wisdom is expected for problems that would challenge modern governments with all their data and expertise. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect was the loneliness embedded in all this ceremony. Though surrounded by hundreds of people, the emperor was fundamentally isolated. Everyone present was performing a role, saying what they thought he wanted to hear, or what court etiquette demanded they say. Genuine conversation was almost impossible. Every word was weighed for political implications. Every suggestion filtered through layers of self-interest and fear. The vizier, or prime minister, depending on the dynasty, served as the crucial bridge between imperial authority and practical governance. This person had perhaps the most dangerous job in the empire, close enough to the emperor to influence decisions, visible enough to take blame when things went wrong, Many prime ministers ended their careers in exile, disgrace, or worse, victims of the impossible balance between serving the empire and preserving their own lives. Decision-making in this environment was unlike anything we experience today. The emperor's words weren't just administrative instructions, they were considered divine mandates. A casual comment about border security might trigger military mobilization. An offhand remark about palace decorations could result in months of frantic renovation work involving thousands of artisans. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. Modern leaders deal with criticism, opposition, alternative viewpoints. The emperor dealt with a world where everyone agreed with him publicly, while privately calculating how his decisions might affect their own survival. The isolation of absolute power, where honest feedback was not just rare, but potentially treasonous. Court ritual demanded that even the most urgent matters be presented with elaborate ceremony. A messenger arriving with news of rebellion couldn't simply blurt out the emergency. Proper protocol required careful approach, formal announcement, ritualized presentation of documents. In a crisis, this formality could mean the difference between effective response and disaster. Yet abandoning protocol was unthinkable. The morning audience typically lasted several hours, during which the emperor was expected to demonstrate divine insight into everything from agricultural policy to military strategy, from legal philosophy to architectural planning, all while maintaining the composed dignity of a living deity who never showed uncertainty, never revealed ignorance, never admitted mistakes. After the formal business of empire, many Chinese emperors turned to intellectual pursuits with a dedication that would impress modern scholars. The Chinese imperial tradition placed enormous emphasis on learning, wisdom, and cultural refinement. An emperor was expected to be not just a ruler, but a paragon of civilization itself. The imperial study was typically a serene refuge from the formal throne rooms, furnished with precious calligraphy supplies, rare books, and scholarly instruments. Here, surrounded by classical texts that had guided Chinese thought for centuries, the emperor continued an education that never truly ended. The great Confucian classics, historical records, poetry collections, and philosophical treatises weren't just reading material. They were the foundation of imperial authority. Imperial tutors were among the most learned men in the empire, selected not just for their knowledge, but for their ability to guide someone whose every decision carried cosmic significance. These weren't classroom teachers, but philosophical counselors, expected to provide wisdom on everything from governance to personal conduct. Teaching the emperor required a delicate balance, offering genuine instruction while never implying criticism of imperial knowledge. The study sessions often focused on historical precedents. How did the great Tang emperors handle similar situations? What lessons could be drawn from the fall of previous dynasties? Chinese imperial culture was deeply historical. Every decision was made with awareness of patterns that stretched back thousands of years. The emperor was expected to see himself as part of an unbroken chain of cosmic rulers, learning from the successes and failures of his predecessors. Calligraphy practice was particularly important, elevated far beyond mere writing to become a spiritual discipline. The emperor's brushwork was considered a reflection of his inner harmony and moral character. Hours might be spent perfecting a single character, not for vanity, but because imperial calligraphy would be studied, copied, and preserved for centuries. Every stroke reflected the cosmic order flowing through the Son of Heaven. Poetry composition was another crucial skill. Chinese emperors were expected to create verses that demonstrated not just artistic ability, but philosophical depth and emotional refinement. These weren't casual creative exercises. Imperial poems became part of the cultural heritage, studied and discussed by scholars throughout the empire. The pressure to create meaningful art while managing an empire must have been immense. But learning served practical purposes too. Understanding military strategy, economic principles, legal precedents, and diplomatic protocols wasn't optional for effective rule. The emperor needed genuine expertise in countless fields, acquired through intensive study that continued throughout their reign. Modern leaders have advisors and specialists. The emperor was expected to be the ultimate generalist, wise in all areas of human knowledge. The intellectual isolation was as profound as the political isolation. The emperor's scholarly discussions were limited to carefully selected tutors and advisors, all aware that disagreeing too strongly with imperial ideas could be career-ending or worse. Genuine intellectual exchange, the kind of robust debate that advances understanding, was nearly impossible when one participant held absolute power over all the others. Despite ruling vast territories stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia, the emperor's personal world was often confined within the walls of the Forbidden City. This wasn't just irony, it was a carefully maintained system that kept the Son of Heaven pure and protected, but also profoundly isolated from the realm he governed. The imperial gardens offered perhaps the only space where the emperor could experience something approaching normal human pleasure. These weren't simple landscaped areas, but masterpieces of design that compressed the entire natural world into carefully controlled spaces. Imagine walking through gardens where every rock, every tree, every water feature had been positioned with the precision of a master artist. Picture the emperor in the early afternoon, walking alone through gardens where artificial mountains create the illusion of wild landscapes, where streams have been channeled to create perfect waterfalls, where rare flowers from across the empire bloom in carefully orchestrated seasons. The only sounds are water trickling over stones, the rustle of silk robes, and perhaps distant court music drifting from pavilions hidden among the trees. For a few precious hours, the weight of cosmic responsibility might lift slightly. These gardens weren't just beautiful, they were philosophical statements. The arrangement of rocks represented mountain ranges, symbolizing the emperor's dominion over all landscapes. Ponds and streams echoed the great rivers that brought life to the empire. Carefully pruned trees suggested the harmony that imperial rule brought to wild nature. Even recreation carried symbolic weight. The pavilions scattered throughout the gardens served as retreats for different moods and activities. Some were designed for contemplation, with perfect views of moon reflections on still water. Others housed libraries of rare books, allowing for scholarly pursuits in natural settings. Still others contained workshops where the emperor might practice crafts. Some rulers became skilled in carpentry, others in ceramics or metalwork. These hobbies weren't just diversions, but crucial psychological outlets. Imagine the relief of creating something with your own hands when your primary job involved making decisions that affected millions of lives. The simple satisfaction of shaping wood or clay must have provided grounding in physical reality that balanced the abstract nature of imperial authority. Some emperors developed obsessive interests that bordered on the eccentric. The Kangxi Emperor was fascinated by Western mechanical devices and scientific instruments. The Qianlong Emperor became one of history's greatest art collectors, personally cataloging thousands of paintings and calligraphy scrolls. These weren't casual hobbies, but intense scholarly pursuits that consumed whatever free time imperial duties allowed. Music provided another form of escape, though even entertainment carried formal significance. Imperial orchestras performed compositions that were specifically designed to harmonize with cosmic rhythms. The emperor might play traditional instruments. The guqin, seven-stringed zither, was particularly associated with scholarly refinement, but even personal music making was understood to contribute to universal harmony. The isolation became most apparent during these leisure activities. While emperors in other cultures might hunt with companions or feast with friends, the Chinese emperor typically enjoyed his pleasures alone or with carefully selected family members. The spontaneous camaraderie that makes recreational activities enjoyable for most people was nearly impossible when everyone present was performing elaborate court etiquette. The gardens changed with the seasons, providing different experiences throughout the year. Spring brought carefully orchestrated flower displays, peonies, chrysanthemums, plum blossoms, each carrying symbolic meanings related to imperial virtues. Summer offered shaded pavilions and cool water features. Autumn provided opportunities for philosophical contemplation on the cycles of nature and human life. Winter's spare beauty suggested the austere virtue required of good governance. But even in these beautiful spaces, the emperor was never truly alone. Guards maintained discreet surveillance, servants anticipated every need, and the knowledge that hundreds of people depended on their safety meant that genuine relaxation was almost impossible. The gardens were exquisite cages, offering the illusion of freedom within the reality of absolute responsibility. As evening settled over the Forbidden City, the Emperor's day took on different rhythms, but the formality and isolation only deepened. The evening meal wasn't a simple dinner, but a carefully orchestrated ceremony that could last for hours, involving dozens of courses, elaborate service protocols, and constant awareness of potential dangers. The dining process itself would seem almost paranoid by modern standards, but for good reason. Every dish was prepared by specially trained cooks whose loyalty had been tested for years. Every ingredient was sourced from trusted suppliers and inspected multiple times. Most importantly, every single item was tasted by official food tasters before reaching the imperial table. These brave individuals literally risked their lives with each meal, testing for poisons that remained undetectable until someone became ill or died. Imagine the tension surrounding something as basic as dinner. The emperor sits at a table set with priceless porcelain, surrounded by attentive servants who watch his every expression for signs of satisfaction or displeasure. But underlying the luxury is the knowledge that any bite could be his last if someone had managed to infiltrate the kitchen or bribe a servant. The food tasters stand nearby, having already sampled everything on the table. their own lives hanging in the balance of the emperor's continued good health. Every meal was a test of the elaborate security systems designed to keep the Son of Heaven alive. The evening's most peculiar ritual might seem almost comical if it weren't so deeply serious: the selection of a consort for the night. After dinner, a eunuch would approach with a silver tray containing small plaques, each inscribed with the name of a concubine or imperial wife. The emperor would select one plaque, and that woman would be summoned to the imperial bedchamber. This system, which might appear coldly mechanical, actually served multiple purposes in the complex politics of imperial succession. It ensured that the emperor's romantic choices were documented, important for establishing legitimacy of any resulting children, prevented any single consort from gaining too much influence through exclusive access, and maintained a semblance of fairness among the numerous women of the imperial household. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, housing not just the emperor's wives and concubines, but hundreds of female servants, eunuch administrators, and the complex hierarchy that governed their interactions. The empress held the highest position, followed by various ranks of consorts, each with specific privileges and responsibilities. For many of these women, life in the harem was a mixture of extraordinary luxury and profound restriction. The politics within the harem could be Byzantine in their complexity. Alliances formed and dissolved based on pregnancy rumors, imperial favor, and the advancement of sons toward the succession. Women who had once been friends might become bitter rivals if their children were potential heirs. The emperor's personal preferences could dramatically affect the status and future of dozens of people. But consider the psychological impact on the emperor himself. His most intimate relationships were shaped by political calculation, documented by bureaucrats, and influenced by succession politics. Genuine emotional connection was complicated by the knowledge that romantic choices carried enormous political consequences. A favorite concubine might find herself at the center of court intrigue simply because the emperor enjoyed her company. The selected consort would be prepared for the encounter with elaborate bathing and grooming rituals performed by specialized servants. She would be carried to the imperial bedchamber in a special sedan chair, often wrapped in silk covers to maintain the mystery and formality of the selection process. Even intimate moments were choreographed according to ancient protocols. Privacy, even in the most personal moments, was limited. Eunuch attendants waited outside the bedchamber, ready to assist with anything required. The knowledge that the encounter might result in pregnancy, and therefore a potential heir to the throne, meant that even romantic interludes carried the weight of dynasty and empire. The morning after such encounters followed strict protocols too. The consort would be escorted back to her quarters and monitored for signs of pregnancy. If conception occurred, her status would rise dramatically, but so would the dangers surrounding her. Pregnant consorts became focal points of court intrigue, their health and the legitimacy of their children subject to intense scrutiny. The emperor's sleep, when it finally came, was watched over by guards who maintained vigilant patrol outside the bedchamber. Even in dreams, the Son of Heaven was never truly alone, never completely safe, never able to forget the enormous responsibilities that would resume with the dawn. The cycle of isolation was complete. Awake The emperor was surrounded by people performing elaborate ceremonies. Asleep, he was protected by guards whose presence reminded him of constant dangers. Every moment of an imperial day was structured, supervised, and significant to the survival of the dynasty. And so, another day closed behind the towering walls of the Forbidden City, a day for the Son of Heaven that blended supreme authority with supreme isolation, infinite luxury with infinite constraint, and cosmic responsibility with profoundly human needs for companionship and simple pleasure. How different his existence was from the Egyptian pharaoh's more direct engagement with the world, and yet how similar in the fundamental loneliness of absolute power. The Chinese emperor was the master of everything within his sight, yet imprisoned by the very customs and protocols that maintained his authority. Perhaps, when night fell and moonlight filtered through the carved window screens, the emperor experienced moments of quiet reflection, wondering what life might be like beyond those magnificent walls. Or perhaps he had grown so accustomed to the elaborate dance of imperial life that simpler existence seemed unimaginable. We modern people, with our casual freedoms and informal relationships, might find it difficult to comprehend such a life. But looking back, we can see that the burden of responsibility and the search for meaning in life are challenges that transcend any particular era or culture. Now, let the images of the Forbidden City slowly fade as we prepare to journey to another place, another time, where daily life held equally fascinating mysteries, though expressed in very different ways. From the opulent palaces and magnificent gardens, let us find our way to a place of greater quietude, a place where life was shaped by faith, discipline, and, well, quite a lot of rules. Welcome to a medieval monastery. Imagine you are a monk, and your day revolves not just around prayer, but around a chain of activities arranged so meticulously that they sometimes become, shall we say, difficult to comprehend. Life in the monastery began long before most people would consider it reasonable, often around midnight or 2 to 3 in the morning, with the tolling of the matins bell. Picture yourself being shaken from whatever dream you might have been enjoying by that deep, bronze voice echoing across stone corridors and sleeping chambers. The monks would rise in the bitter darkness, their breath visible in the cold air of unheated dormitories. No central heating, no warm slippers waiting by the bed, just the shock of bare feet on cold stone floors, and the scramble to find the rough woolen habit that served as both day clothes and pajamas in this austere world. Imagine the scene. Dozens of figures in rough brown robes shuffling through corridors lit only by flickering candles, their faces still puffy with sleep, making their way to the chapel for prayers that would last for hours. The silence is broken only by the soft whisper of sandaled feet on stone, an occasional cough quickly suppressed, and the ever-present tolling of bells that governed every moment of monastic life. The matin service itself was a test of endurance that would challenge modern attention spans. Hours of chanting, psalms, readings from scripture, all performed in Latin that most monks understood imperfectly, all while standing on those same cold stone floors. The chapel, magnificent in its austere beauty, offered little comfort. Hard wooden benches at best, more often just the stone floor beneath their feet. This wasn't a brief morning prayer, but a profound spiritual exercise that could last until dawn. The human voice, dozens of voices joining in ancient melodies, created an otherworldly atmosphere in those stone chambers. The acoustics of medieval chapels were designed to make these chants resonate, creating an almost hypnotic effect that might have helped the monks transcend their physical discomfort. Think about the discipline required every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of health, regardless of how little sleep they'd gotten the night before. These men rose in darkness to spend hours in prayer and contemplation. No sick days, no sleeping in on weekends. The bells tolled, and the faithful answered. The psychological impact must have been significant. Starting each day in darkness, with hours of contemplation before engaging with any practical tasks, created a rhythm of life completely foreign to our modern experience. Their days began not with checking phones or grabbing coffee, but with confronting the eternal questions that shape their entire existence. Ora et labora, pray and work, was the motto that governed monastic life, and after the early morning prayers, the practical business of survival began. Medieval monasteries were largely self-sufficient communities, which meant there was always an enormous amount of work to be done. The variety of tasks was staggering. From dawn until dusk, monks might find themselves gardening, tending livestock, brewing beer. Monastery beer was famous throughout Europe. Baking bread, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, practicing medicine with herbal remedies, teaching in monastery schools, or maintaining the complex buildings and grounds that housed their community. The physical labor was often backbreaking, especially during harvest seasons or construction projects. Picture monks in their rough woolen habits, bent over hoes in vegetable gardens, their hands cracked and dirty from working soil that had to feed the entire community. Or imagine them in the brewing halls, stirring massive vats of fermenting grain, their faces flushed from heat and steam, a far cry from our image of contemplative spirituality. The scriptorium deserves special attention. Imagine a long, cold room filled with wooden desks, each occupied by a monk hunched over precious parchment, carefully copying religious texts with quill pens that had to be constantly sharpened and re-inked. Their breath formed clouds in the winter air as they worked, and their hands became so cold that writing became almost impossible. Yet they persevered, creating the illuminated manuscripts that preserved knowledge through the dark ages. Many monks spent their entire adult lives in these chilly rooms, copying the same texts over and over, their eyes straining in the dim light, their backs aching from bending over their work. The working conditions were harsh by any standard. Medieval winters were particularly brutal, and monastery buildings, despite their impressive architecture, offered little protection from the cold. The stone walls that looked so magnificent also conducted cold with ruthless efficiency. Monks worked with numb fingers, runny noses, and the constant awareness that their physical comfort mattered far less than their spiritual development. But the labor served purposes beyond mere survival. Physical work was considered a form of prayer, a way of participating in God's creative activity. When a monk spent hours copying scripture, he wasn't just preserving knowledge, he was meditating on every word, every letter, allowing the sacred text to become part of his being through the physical act of reproduction. The monastery gardens were often marvels of agricultural innovation. Monks became expert botanists, developing new varieties of fruits and vegetables, perfecting techniques for crop rotation, and maintaining orchards that produced both food and the ingredients for various medicines. These weren't just practical gardens, but carefully planned ecosystems that demonstrated the harmony they believed should exist between human activity and natural creation. Cooking duties rotated among the brothers, and monastery kitchens had to feed large communities with limited resources. The creativity required to make simple ingredients interesting day after day, season after season, turned many monks into accomplished chefs. The recipes developed in monastery kitchens often spread to the surrounding communities, influencing regional cuisine for centuries. The breweries deserve special mention because monastery beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a nutritional necessity. In an era when water quality was often questionable, weak beer provided both hydration and calories. Monks became master brewers, developing techniques and recipes that influenced European beer-making traditions that continue today. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that some of the holiest men in Europe were also some of the best beer makers. Construction and maintenance work required skills that would impress modern craftsmen. Monks learned masonry, carpentry, metalworking, and engineering out of necessity. When the monastery roof leaked or a wall needed repair, they couldn't call contractors. They had to develop the expertise themselves. Many of the greatest medieval cathedrals and monastery buildings were designed and built by monks who learned their trades through necessity and perfected them through decades of practice. The psychological benefits of this varied labor shouldn't be underestimated. After hours of intense prayer and contemplation, the physical activity provided balance and grounding. Working with their hands, seeing tangible results from their efforts, connecting with the natural world through farming. These activities anchored the monks' spiritual practices in practical reality. Mealtime in a medieval monastery was unlike any dining experience you've ever had, and probably unlike any you'd want to have. The food itself was deliberately simple, primarily vegetables, bread, and perhaps fish on special occasions. Meat was often completely forbidden or allowed only on rare feast days, making the monastic diet essentially vegetarian centuries before that became a lifestyle choice. But the real challenge wasn't the food, it was eating it in complete silence. During meals, the only voice allowed was that of one monk, typically standing at a lectern, reading aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. Everyone else ate in perfect silence, listening to stories of martyrdom and miraculous conversions while trying to chew their bread without making any noise. Picture this scene: a long hall filled with dozens of monks seated at wooden tables, heads bowed over simple wooden bowls, the only sounds being the steady voice of the reader and the occasional, carefully suppressed clink of a spoon against pottery. Someone accidentally drops their bread, and the sound echoes through the hall like a gunshot, drawing disapproving glances from brothers who can't verbally express their irritation. The poor monk who made the noise spends the rest of the meal in mortified silence, knowing his clumsiness has disrupted the sacred atmosphere. The rules governing eating behavior were extraordinarily specific and, frankly, somewhat mystifying. Some monastic orders forbade using more than 2 fingers to handle food. Apparently 3 fingers suggested gluttony. Others prohibited making any sound while chewing, which must have made eating apples or carrots a particular challenge. There were regulations about where to look while eating, generally downward, never at other diners. how to hold utensils, and even the proper way to wipe one's mouth. The purpose behind these elaborate restrictions was to transform even the most basic human activities into opportunities for spiritual discipline. Eating wasn't just refueling the body, it was practicing mindfulness, humility, and self control. Every bite was supposed to be taken with gratitude and awareness, though one imagines that sometimes the monks were more aware of their growling stomachs than their spiritual state. Beverages were equally regulated. Water was standard, but weak beer or wine was sometimes allowed, carefully measured to provide nutrition without encouraging indulgence. Tea and coffee didn't exist in medieval Europe, so there was no caffeinated salvation from the morning grogginess that must have plagued men who rose before dawn every day. The serving of meals followed strict hierarchies and protocols. Food was distributed according to rank and need, with older or sicker monks sometimes receiving slightly better portions. But this wasn't favoritism. It was practical care wrapped in spiritual principle. The community took responsibility for each member's physical well-being while maintaining the equality that monastic life represented. Seasonal variations in the menu reflected both agricultural realities and religious calendar. Fasting periods meant even more restricted diets, while feast days might bring small luxuries, perhaps honey cake or fresh fruit. The monks' relationship with food became deeply connected to the liturgical year, their bodies literally experiencing the rhythms of religious observance through what they ate and when they ate it. Kitchen duties rotated among the brothers, and serving meals was considered a privilege and spiritual exercise. The monks who prepared and served food weren't considered servants, but brothers performing acts of love for their community. This attitude transformed mundane tasks into sacred service, though it probably didn't make peeling endless turnips any more exciting. The dining hall itself was typically a magnificent stone chamber with soaring arches and beautiful acoustics designed to carry the reader's voice clearly to every seat. These weren't grim prison cafeterias, but architectural achievements that elevated the simple act of eating into something approaching worship. The beauty of the space was meant to remind the monks that even their most basic needs were gifts to be received with reverence. If you thought the 3 a.m. wake-up call was challenging, prepare yourself for the reality that it was just the beginning. A monk's day was divided into 7 or 8 distinct prayer periods called the canonical hours, each announced by those omnipresent bells that governed every moment of monastic life. After matins came lauds at dawn, followed by prime in the early morning. Then terce around 9 a.m., sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, and finally compline before bed. Some communities added additional services, making it possible for a dedicated monk to spend nearly half his waking hours in formal prayer. The bells that announced these services weren't subtle suggestion chimes. They were commanding bronze voices that could be heard for miles, calling not just the monks, but entire surrounding communities to awareness of sacred time. The bell ringer held a position of crucial responsibility because missing a service due to late bells could disrupt the spiritual rhythm of dozens of people. Each service had its own character and purpose. Lauds celebrated the dawn and new beginnings. Terce commemorated the descent of the Holy Spirit. Sext marked the crucifixion hour. Vespers welcomed the evening. These weren't repetitive obligations, but opportunities to align human activity with cosmic rhythms that had governed Christian practice for centuries. The psychological impact of this constant rhythm cannot be overstated. Modern people struggle to maintain simple daily routines. Imagine organizing your entire life around 8 separate prayer appointments that never changed, never got postponed, never allowed for personal preference or convenience. The bells tolled, and faithful monks responded, regardless of weather, illness, or personal inclination. The prayers themselves involved complex cycles of psalms, readings, and chants that changed according to the liturgical calendar. Monks had to memorize enormous amounts of text and music, becoming walking libraries of sacred literature. Their minds were constantly occupied with fragments of scripture, musical phrases, and theological concepts that shaped their understanding of everything they experienced. The repetitive nature of these services created a meditative state that modern mindfulness practitioners would recognize. The same psalms, chanted hundreds of times each year, became so deeply embedded in consciousness that they provided a constant internal soundtrack of spiritual awareness. Many monks reported that psalm verses would spontaneously arise in their minds during work or other activities, creating an almost continuous prayer experience. The community aspect of these services was crucial. Unlike private prayer, the canonical hours required monks to gather, to harmonize their voices, to participate in collective worship that transcended individual preference or mood. A monk having a bad day still had to show up and sing, and often found that the act of participating in community prayer lifted his spirits despite his personal struggles. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of monastic life was the contradiction at its heart. These men lived in intimate community while maintaining profound silence, sharing everything while preserving individual spiritual space, supporting each other while avoiding the casual friendships that make most communities enjoyable. The dormitories where monks slept were typically large, shared spaces with simple beds arranged in rows. Privacy was almost non-existent. Imagine sharing a bedroom with dozens of other adults, listening to their snoring, coughing, and nighttime movements while maintaining the emotional distance required by monastic discipline. Personal possessions were minimal and standardized. A habit, sandals, perhaps a prayer book, all identical and interchangeable. The great silence deserves particular attention because it created a communication challenge that would drive most modern people to distraction. From Compline until the morning prayers, absolute silence was maintained throughout the monastery. No talking, no whispering, no unnecessary noise of any kind. The night hours were reserved for sleep and private prayer, and any communication that couldn't wait until morning had to be conducted through elaborate hand signals. These hand signals developed into a sophisticated language that would fascinate linguists today. A monk kneading paper in the scriptorium might make writing motions with his fingers. Someone requesting bread in the kitchen would make kneading gestures. A brother asking for help with heavy lifting would flex his arms and point. The comedy potential was enormous. Imagine trying to communicate. The cow got loose and is eating the vegetable garden using only hand gestures, while maintaining the spiritual dignity appropriate to monastic life. But silence extended beyond the formal Great Silence periods. Many areas of the monastery, the chapel, library, and sometimes the dining hall, maintained perpetual quiet zones where verbal communication was forbidden or strictly limited. Monks developed an acute awareness of nonverbal communication, reading facial expressions, body language, and subtle gestures with sensitivity that exceeded most married couples. The irony was profound. These men who had chosen to live in community often experienced deeper isolation than hermits who lived alone. A hermit could at least talk to himself, sing while working, or express emotions verbally. Monks lived surrounded by brothers, while often feeling profoundly alone with their thoughts, their struggles, and their spiritual questions. Yet this isolation served important purposes. Without the constant chatter that characterizes most human communities, monks were forced to develop inner resources, to find comfort in their own company, to listen more carefully to their spiritual intuitions. The silence created space for contemplation that modern people, surrounded by constant noise and stimulation, rarely experience. Conflicts inevitably arose in such close quarters living, but they had to be resolved without the verbal processing that most people rely on. Disagreements simmered in silence, resentments built without outlet, personality clashes developed without the relief of complaint or gossip. The emotional pressure must have been enormous, though the monastic ideal taught that such challenges were opportunities for spiritual growth. The abbot served as father figure, counselor, disciplinarian, and final authority for the community. Monks could speak privately with him during designated times, but these conversations were formal counseling sessions rather than casual friendship. The abbot bore the psychological burden of being the only person in the community who could hear everyone's problems while having no peer to share his own struggles. Recreation, when it occurred, was as carefully regulated as everything else. Some communities allowed brief periods of conversation during certain feast days or while performing specific tasks. These moments of social interaction must have been precious releases from the constant internal pressure of maintaining silence while living so closely with others. The physical intimacy of shared dormitories, common meals, and group activities created bonds that transcended friendship while remaining entirely spiritual. Monks knew each other's sleeping habits, work rhythms, and personal quirks more intimately than most family members, yet maintained emotional distances that prevented the casual warmth most humans crave. Medical care within the monastery required special adaptations. When a monk fell ill, care had to be provided while maintaining the spiritual discipline that governed healthy members. The infirmary became one of the few places where silence rules might be relaxed slightly, allowing patients to communicate their needs and caregivers to provide comfort. The seasonal rhythms of monastic life created variety within the strict routine. Summer brought longer work days and different agricultural tasks. Winter meant more time in the scriptorium and longer periods of indoor prayer. But the fundamental structure never changed. Bells tolled, prayers were said, work was done, meals were eaten in silence, and the great silence descended each night like a familiar blanket of spiritual discipline. And so, night would fall again over those ancient stone walls, the final bell of Compline echoing across the countryside, signaling another day of labor. and prayer had reached its end. The monks would return to their simple beds, wrapping themselves in rough blankets, settling into the great silence that would last until those bronze voices called them once again to midnight prayer. Their lives, viewed from our comfortable distance, seem almost impossibly austere, repetitive, and bound by rules that sometimes appear to border on the absurd. Yet for these men, this was a path toward peace, enlightenment, and closeness to the divine they served, a kind of spiritual survival in a medieval world full of chaos and uncertainty beyond those protective monastery walls. Perhaps there's a strange beauty in that repetition, that discipline, that silence we modern people, surrounded by constant noise and endless choices, sometimes find ourselves longing for. The rhythm of bells, the security of routine, the clarity that comes from having every decision already made by centuries of tradition. Now, as your mind grows quieter, more peaceful, let us gently leave this sacred space and explore another dimension of daily life from the past, where creativity and private joys found expression in ways that might surprise you. After visiting those mighty pharaohs in their golden authority, those isolated emperors behind their towering walls, and those devoted monks in their silent service, perhaps you're wondering what other peculiar habits history has accidentally left behind for us to discover. Certainly there are many. The ancient world was vast and full of surprises. In this final chapter, we'll gather together a few small but fascinating fragments from different cultures and times. Consider them a gentle dessert before you drift completely into sleep. The ancient Romans took great pride in their public bathhouses, the thermae, and rightly so. These weren't just places to get clean, but elaborate social centers that would make our modern spas look rather modest by comparison. Picture massive buildings with soaring ceilings, intricate mosaics covering every surface, and the constant sound of flowing water from sophisticated aqueduct systems that brought fresh mountain spring water directly into the heart of the city. But here's where things get interesting for our modern sensibilities. These weren't private, individual experiences. Romans bathed together, socialized together, conducted business together, and, well, let's just say they took the concept of public facilities to levels that would make most of us quite uncomfortable today. The bathing process itself was an elaborate ritual that could consume entire afternoons. Visitors would start in the apoditerium, the changing room, where they would strip completely and entrust their clothes to slaves who may or may not still be there when they returned. From there, they progressed through a series of increasingly warm rooms. The tepidarium, warm bath. The caldarium, hot bath, more like a sauna. And finally, the frigidarium, cold plunge, to close the pores and invigorate the circulation. But perhaps the most culturally shocking aspect for modern visitors would be the latrines. Public toilets, arranged in long rows of stone seats with no partitions, no privacy walls, nothing but a continuous marble bench with holes cut at regular intervals. Romans would sit side by side, conducting conversations, discussing politics, or negotiating business deals while attending to their most personal needs. And instead of toilet paper, they shared a spongia, a natural sponge attached to a stick, which was rinsed in salt water or vinegar between uses and passed along to the next person. The social bonding opportunities were unique. After bathing, Romans didn't use towels as we know them. Instead, They would coat their skin with olive oil and then use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape away the oil along with dirt, dead skin, and the day's accumulated grime. It was like an ancient form of exfoliation, though the process sounds rather more aggressive than our modern spa treatments. The social aspect of the baths cannot be overstated. These were the country clubs of ancient Rome, where important business deals were negotiated, political alliances formed, and gossip exchanged. Libraries were often attached to the larger bath complexes, along with gymnasiums, gardens, and even small theaters. A Roman citizen could easily spend an entire day at the baths without ever feeling bored. The engineering behind these facilities was remarkable. Hippocaust systems, essentially ancient central heating, circulated hot air through hollow walls and floors, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the massive buildings. The Romans had solved problems of heating, water supply, and waste management that many cultures wouldn't master for another 1,000 years. But imagine the sensory experience, the constant sound of flowing water, voices echoing off marble walls, the scent of perfumed oils mixing with steam, the feel of warm stone beneath bare feet. For Romans, this was daily life, as normal as our morning showers, though infinitely more social and time-consuming. Travel with me now to Heian period Japan, roughly the 8th to 12th centuries, where the imperial court developed aesthetic standards that would seem quite startling to modern eyes. Among the aristocratic ladies, and some gentlemen as well, one of the most prized beauty treatments was ohaguro, the deliberate blackening of teeth. This wasn't a sign of poor dental hygiene, but rather the height of sophisticated beauty. Married women of the court, and sometimes men of particular refinement, would undergo the elaborate process of dyeing their teeth a glossy black that was considered far more elegant than the natural white enamel that we prize today. The process itself was remarkably complex and had to be repeated regularly to maintain the desired effect. The dye was made from iron filings dissolved in tea or sake, mixed with powdered gallnut or other plant tannins. The resulting mixture was painted onto the teeth, creating a lacquer-like finish that gleamed like polished obsidian. Picture the scene in a high-end court lady's chambers. Attendants carefully applying the black dye with delicate brushes, while the noble woman sits perfectly still, her white powdered face creating a stark contrast that made the blackened teeth appear even more dramatic. The process required patience and precision. Any mistakes would be immediately visible and socially embarrassing. The final effect, combined with the elaborate white face powder, rouged lips, and dramatically darkened eyebrows, created a look that was considered the pinnacle of otherworldly beauty. But ohaguro wasn't purely aesthetic. The iron-based dye actually helped strengthen and preserve the teeth, working as a kind of ancient dental sealant that protected against decay. In an era without modern dental care, this cosmetic treatment served a practical purpose that our ancestors understood instinctively. The social significance was equally important. Blackened teeth indicated that a woman was married, wealthy enough to afford the expensive dyes and time-consuming application process, and sophisticated enough to embrace the court's refined aesthetic standards. It was a status symbol as clear as any piece of jewelry or elaborate kimono. The contrast with our modern beauty standards is striking. Today, people spend fortunes on teeth whitening treatments, pursuing the bright white smile that the Heian court would have considered rather vulgar and peasant-like. Natural white teeth were associated with commoners who couldn't afford the elegant refinement of ohaguro. The practice persisted for centuries, even into the Meiji period of the late 1800s, when Western influence began to change Japanese beauty standards. Gradually, the custom faded as white teeth became associated with modernity and international sophistication. But for nearly 1,000 years, the most beautiful women in Japan proudly displayed smiles that gleamed like polished ebony. The Vikings are famous as warriors and seafarers, but their daily life held many surprises, particularly in their approach to food and hospitality. Their meals weren't just sustenance, but chronicles of their remarkable journeys, each dish potentially carrying flavors and ingredients from distant lands that most people of their era never imagined existed. Imagine arriving at a Viking longhouse on a winter evening. The great hall is warm and smoky, lit by flickering fires and oil lamps. The host proudly presents the evening's feast: dried cod from the North Atlantic, berries preserved from the brief Arctic summer, ale brewed with honey traded from Byzantine merchants, and perhaps most surprising of all, exotic spices acquired during raids or trading expeditions to lands as distant as Constantinople or even North Africa. Each bite tells a story of adventure, danger, and the remarkable range of Viking exploration. The preservation techniques Vikings developed were born of necessity, but became art forms in their own right. Stockfish, cod dried in the cold, clean air of the North Atlantic, could last for years without spoiling, providing protein during long sea voyages or harsh winters. The fish became so hard it had to be beaten with hammers before cooking, but it retained its nutritional value and could sustain crews through months-long expeditions. Skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to thick yogurt, was another staple that showcased Viking ingenuity. Made from sheep or cow milk and fermented with cultures that were carefully maintained and passed down through generations, Skyr provided essential nutrients and probiotics that helped Vikings maintain their health during periods when fresh foods were unavailable. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Viking cuisine was its international character. These supposedly isolated northern warriors regularly consumed foods that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern cosmopolitan restaurant. Walnuts from the Black Sea region, silk root spices, wine from Mediterranean vineyards, even occasional exotic fruits that had survived the long journey north. The drinking culture was equally sophisticated, though considerably more robust than modern social drinking. Mead, fermented honey wine, was the prestige beverage, often flavored with herbs and spices that had medicinal as well as gustatory purposes. The great drinking horns passed around Viking halls weren't just vessels, but ceremonial objects that bound communities together through shared rituals of hospitality and honor. Feast preparation was a community effort that could take days. Entire animals would be roasted over open fires, while teams of cooks prepared the numerous side dishes, breads, and preserved foods that made these gatherings legendary. The coordination required to feed 100 warriors and their families was substantial, requiring skills and logistics that served Vikings well during their military campaigns. The seasonal nature of ingredients created anticipation and celebration around certain foods. The brief summer growing season made fresh vegetables precious, while the autumn hunt determined how much fresh meat would be available through the winter. Spring brought new possibilities as trade routes reopened and the first fishing expeditions of the year returned with their catches. Table manners, such as they were, emphasized generosity and courage. Guests were expected to eat heartily as a sign of respect for their host's hospitality. Refusing food could be seen as an insult, while consuming impressive quantities was considered praiseworthy. The combination of strong drink, competitive eating, and warrior culture occasionally led to memorable dinner parties that lasted for days. In the 19th century, during the height of the Victorian era, when telephone calls and instant messaging were still the stuff of fantasy, letter writing was elevated to an art form that would make our modern communication seem almost primitive in its directness and simplicity. Victorian correspondence wasn't just about conveying information. It was an intricate dance of social codes, hidden meanings, and elaborate courtesies that could take years to master. The paper itself spoke volumes. Its quality, color, and scent all carried messages about the sender's social status, current mood, and intentions. Black bordered paper indicated mourning, while perfume stationery might suggest romantic interest or simply fashionable sophistication. The language of flowers, floriography, added another layer of complexity to Victorian communication. A bouquet sent with a letter wasn't just decorative, but a coded message as specific as written words. Red roses declared passionate love, while yellow roses suggested friendship. Forget-me-nots pleaded for remembrance, while chrysanthemums could indicate either death or devoted love, depending on their color and the cultural context of the sender. But perhaps most fascinating was the secret language of postage stamp placement. The position of the stamp on an envelope could convey different emotional messages. A stamp placed upright in the upper right corner meant "I love you," while a stamp positioned upside down might indicate "I hate you" or "our relationship is in trouble." A stamp placed at an angle could suggest "I am thinking of you," while placement in the lower left corner might mean "I desire your friendship." Imagine the anxiety of Victorian lovers carefully positioning their stamps, knowing that a slight misplacement could send entirely the wrong message to their beloved. The actual writing process was ceremonial in its precision. Proper Victorian letter writing required specific papers, appropriate ink colors, particular pen nibs, and writing postures that were taught as carefully as dancing or music. The greeting, the body paragraphs, and the closing all followed strict formulas that varied depending on the relationship between correspondent and recipient, the occasion for writing, and the social status of both parties. Waiting for replies created a kind of sweet torture that modern instant communication has eliminated entirely. A letter sent from London to Edinburgh might take several days to arrive, and the response could require another week to complete the round trip. During this waiting period, the sender would analyze every word they had written, wondering about the recipient's reaction, imagining possible responses, and often composing multiple follow-up letters in their mind. The physical act of letter writing required supplies and space that made it a deliberate, planned activity rather than the casual communication we're accustomed to. Quality writing paper was expensive. Good ink had to be properly mixed, Pen nibs required careful maintenance, and letters were often written in specially designated writing rooms or at elegant writing desks that were pieces of furniture as much as functional workspaces. Preservation of correspondence was another ritual entirely. Important letters were kept in special boxes, tied with ribbons, and occasionally perfumed with sachets. Love letters might be read and reread until they were worn soft from handling, while business correspondence was filed with the precision of legal documents. The physical presence of these letters in Victorian homes created a kind of intimate archive of relationships and experiences that our digital age struggles to replicate. The loss of this elaborate communication culture represents something profound about how human relationships have changed. The time and effort required to compose, send, and receive Victorian letters forced a kind of mindfulness and intentionality that our instant messaging culture has largely abandoned. Every word mattered because words were precious, limited, and irreversible once committed to paper and sent into the world. And there you have it, just a few scattered fragments from the vast mosaic of human daily life across the centuries. From the chatty communal baths of Rome, to the mysterious black smiles of high-end court ladies, from the international feasts of Viking halls, to the secret messages hidden in Victorian correspondence, each small detail reminds us that being human has always been a wonderfully complex, sometimes peculiar, enterprise. These glimpses into the past show us that the distance between our ancestors and ourselves isn't measured only in years, but in the marvelously different ways people have chosen to live, to connect with each other, and to find meaning in the small rituals that fill our days. What seemed perfectly normal to them appears strange to us, just as our habits would likely mystify and amuse them. But perhaps there's comfort in recognizing that humans have always been creative, social, sometimes silly creatures, doing their best to navigate life with whatever customs and technologies their times provided. The fundamental needs for connection, beauty, nourishment, and communication remain constant, even as the methods for meeting those needs evolve in ways both practical and wonderfully bizarre. Now, as your mind has wandered through these gentle scenes from distant times and places, perhaps it's ready to create its own quiet stories in the landscape of dreams. And so, our gentle journey through the peculiar habits of the past draws to a close. From the dawn rituals of those divine pharaohs, through the golden isolation of Chinese emperors behind their towering walls, to the disciplined silence of medieval monks, and finally to those scattered delightful fragments of daily life from around the world. I hope these stories have brought you a little peace, a touch of wonder, and perhaps a pleasant drowsiness. There's something rather magical about peering into these ancient lives, isn't there? The habits, the ceremonies, the things they considered important, normal, even sacred, they seem so foreign, sometimes almost absurd from our modern perspective. It reminds us that the life we're living right now, with all its technologies and conveniences and freedoms that we often take for granted, is actually quite extraordinary, built upon the accumulated wisdom and struggles of countless generations who came before us. A comfortable mattress, a private bathroom, a meal we can eat without fear of poison or elaborate ceremony, the right to speak our minds freely. These seemingly simple things were luxuries beyond imagination for so many of the people we visited tonight. Even our ability to lie here, listening to stories for pure enjoyment without worrying about midnight prayer bells or dawn audiences with anxious officials. This is a kind of freedom that would have seemed miraculous to most humans throughout history. But perhaps that's one of the most beautiful gifts that history can offer us during these quiet evening hours. A gentle sense of gratitude, not the overwhelming, guilt-inducing kind that keeps us awake, but a soft appreciation that settles into our bones like warmth from a favorite blanket. When we see how complicated, constrained, and often harsh daily life was for even the most powerful people in history, our own lives, with all their modern stresses and complications, begin to seem rather blessed. And yet, there were threads of connection too, weren't there? The Egyptian Pharaoh playing board games with his family, finding moments of simple human joy despite all the divine responsibility. The Chinese emperor walking alone in his garden, perhaps longing for the ordinary friendships that his cosmic status made impossible. The medieval monks discovering that even the most austere spiritual discipline couldn't eliminate the need for humor, creativity, and community. The Romans chatting in their bathhouses, the Japanese court ladies perfecting their beauty rituals, the Vikings sharing stories over their international feasts, the Victorians crafting elaborate letters, all of them seeking connection, meaning, and small pleasures within whatever circumstances their times and cultures provided. In the end, we're all just humans trying to make sense of our days, to find comfort and purpose and moments of happiness, whatever century we happen to inhabit. The methods change dramatically. Golden burial masks give way to morning coffee. Dragon robes become business suits. Monastery bells are replaced by smartphone alarms. But the fundamental needs remain beautifully, reassuringly constant. Tonight, as you prepare to join the endless human tradition of sleep and dreams, you can rest in the knowledge that you're part of this vast, continuous story of people doing their best to live meaningful lives. Your own daily routines, however ordinary they might seem, are just as valid, just as human, as the elaborate ceremonies we've explored together. And who knows? Perhaps 1,000 years from now, some future storyteller will be describing our peculiar 21st century habits to drowsy listeners in whatever format entertainment takes by then. Imagine, they might say, these ancient people would stare at small glowing rectangles for hours each day. And they thought nothing of climbing into metal boxes that moved at incredible speeds. And they had to manually brush their teeth every single morning. Our normal will seem just as quaint and mysterious to them as Pharaoh's dream interpreters seem to us. But that's a story for future generations to tell. Tonight, this moment belongs to you. You've been patient with these rambling tales from distant times and places. You've let your imagination wander through palace halls and monastery corridors, Roman bathhouses and Japanese courts, Viking feasts and Victorian drawing rooms. You've been the perfect traveling companion for this gentle exploration of human peculiarity and resilience. Now it's time to let those images fade softly into whatever dreams await you. Let the voices of the past become whispers, then silence. Let the weight of centuries dissolve into the simple comfort of your pillow, your blankets, your safe and private space. Thank you for spending this evening with me wandering through the corridors of time. I hope this voice and these stories have been pleasant company for you, helping you find the relaxation and peaceful sleep you were seeking. Sleep well, dream beautiful dreams, and wake tomorrow with a light heart and a gentle spirit. Now then, close your eyes and rest. Sweet dreams.